let's look at there's a kind of asymmetric war going on involving the Strait of Hormuz, and we've discussed that earlier. There's also an asymmetric war going on in terms of the aspirations and interests of America and Israel, it seems to me, where all the mood music coming out of Netanyahu, and we saw a bit of it with Naftali Bennett earlier, is that they believe this is nowhere near finished, this mission, that there cannot be any kind of victory until Iran's nuclear capability is destroyed and the enriched uranium has been removed. Now, I don't see that they're anywhere near doing either of those things, and nor is there any incentive right now for Iran to surrender those things voluntarily. So where are we? Because the pressure, as Paul Rykov rightly observed just then, is piling on Donald Trump. I'm sure from the softening of his own rhetoric in the last few days, he's desperate to get out of this thing, but he doesn't quite know how to. And he's got the Israelis saying, we cannot just walk away. This job is only half finished.
Yeah, I agree. And look, the whole enriched uranium nuclear program is a smokescreen. The reality of it is Israel has wanted the regime change in Iran since '79. So has parts of the US government as well. And they're using the nuclear program as a way of trying to basically distract from the real purpose. And that's why, you know, they went in last year and there was a 12-day war, and that was called a success by the Israelis and the Americans. And we're back to where we were. And the other massive point is, look, we're talking about the strategy and who might win and who might lose. This was a major international war crime. This was a violation of Article 2 of the UN Charter. You can't just attack a country which is not a threat to you, and it's not a threat to them. And they should be indicted for it. You know, we've already got the Prime Minister of Israel already has an arrest warrant out from the ICC. Another one should go out to Donald Trump. And I actually think it's a bit disgusting to talk about the war in these terms of how can we open the Strait of Hormuz, blah, blah, blah. We're talking about a major international crime where the Americans and the Israelis killed nearly 200 schoolgirls as one of the first acts of the war. And they claimed that it was a mistake, but it might not have even been a mistake. We've seen how the Israelis act. We've seen how the Americans act, and we've seen what they've done in Gaza, what they've done in Lebanon. They target civilians, they target kids. They want to send the impression that they will tolerate no resistance. So we're dealing with outlaw rogue states that need to be held in check. And the legal institutions can't do it. The ICC and West warrants have done nothing. In fact, European partners of Israel have not enforced it at all, even members of the ICC. So where do we go from there? We live in the law of the jungle now. And I think that the reason that this will carry on, the reason there's this breach is because they don't even know what to do now, because they obviously believed going in hard, as you said, that Netanyahu gave this PowerPoint presentation to Trump and said, look, the IRGC will collapse if we kill the Ayatollah. It didn't happen. So where do they go now? The uprising, which they've been trying to foment, by the way, for years. And there was a good article in the Israeli press which came out in recent days about how Mossad has been fomenting unrest in Iran and was even involved in the December protests. It's not working. And as you said, this criminal attack has actually had the opposite impact. It's got people behind the government in Iran, people who previously weren't, because they see that they're being attacked by hostile, violent powers that want to take control of their country. Because why is Iran a threat? Iran's a threat because it's not under the control of the United States and Israel. The Gulf dictatorships, many of them are worse than the political situation in Iran. Look at Saudi Arabia. You get put to death for a tweet there. Who's the biggest supporters of Saudi Arabia? UK and US. So the whole human rights stuff is rubbish. The uranium nuclear program is rubbish. And look, Piers, I'll end with this. You led the charge against the war in Iraq, which was supposedly based around WMDs. That was completely false. So the nuclear deal is the same. It's part of the same dynamic. And look, Tulsi Gabbard, who is the Director of National Intelligence for Trump, she made a testimony in Congress in March 2025, where she said the intelligence community has come to the conclusion that Iran has no nuclear weapons program. That's Tulsi Gabbard saying that, and then Trump obviously rubbished it a couple of months later. But we live swimming in propaganda, and so much of this war is propaganda. The real reason they are bombing Iran is they want to get rid of a government that does not do what they're told.
Okay, Colonel Kemp, I mean, there's a lot of people that share a lot of those views about this. My view is slightly more nuanced in that I can understand, for example, when the Iranian nuclear capability was attacked from the air last summer in that 12-day war, it seemed a very clean, surgical, effective military action with a specific purpose that we were told had been incredibly successful. Part of the failure of trust now is that we were told after that 12-day war their nuclear capabilities been destroyed. And yet here we were back within just 8-9 months launching a full war against Iran to get rid of their nuclear capability, which they were about to imminently deploy. And this reminded me of what happened with the Iraq war in 2003, which, as editor of a Daily Mirror newspaper in the UK, I very loudly opposed, even though I had my own brother fighting in it when it started. But the reason was I wasn't convinced by the evidence that said that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction and was about to use them and could hit London in 45 minutes, none of which turned out to be true. So those with long memories, are very cynical about this. What would you say to try and reassure people who are cynical that Iran did have the nuclear capability, was about to use it? And how do you explain, if that is the case, that what happened last summer clearly wasn't a success after all?
Well, I don't suggest that Iran was about to use a nuclear weapon. I don't think Iran had a nuclear weapon, but it was clearly, and I think, even there are plenty of conspiracy theorists around who say that there is no such thing as an Iranian nuclear program. Well, I think the International Atomic Energy Agency would disagree with that and has disagreed with that in its reports. To my mind, of all the studying I've done, I have no doubt that Iran was working on a nuclear program. And it's not just me who thinks that, it's not just the West who thinks that, but it's many countries in the Middle East who saw that program in progress and were themselves taking steps to arm themselves against it. For example, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, the UAE, all of them have been looking at the potential for their own nuclear weapons program in light of what Iran's got. And those people who say, oh, yeah, well, Israel's also got nuclear weapons, well, it says it doesn't accept that it has, but I think most people agree it has. But none of these countries ever embarked on their own nuclear weapons program in defense against an Israeli nuclear system. So it's Iran that's the threat, and that's understood, I think, it's certainly understood by the United States administration, it's understood by most of the Gulf states, and it's understood, of course, by Israel. So I think that the reality is that there was a nuclear program. It was potentially going to become a nuclear weapon that's capable of being delivered certainly around the region and potentially even further afield, and it had to be put a stop to. As far as the damage done in the 12-day war, I don't think anybody, no one that I read or heard in positions of authority around the US or elsewhere said that the 12-day war had completely destroyed Iran's nuclear.
Donald Trump did.
Maybe he did. I didn't see that.
He said it had been set back decades. He's the president of the United States. He was the one who basically ordered the strike. So the very most powerful and important person imaginable was the one who publicly declared, we have set back Iran's nuclear capability decades. It turned out we hadn't even set it back. But here's my point, though, Colonel Kev. We hadn't, it turned out, even set it back 8 months. And in fact, the threat seems to have worsened, according to those who support this war, to the degree there had to be an immediate, massive strike and a war launched. And I find those two positions extremely inconsistent. How can we go from it's been set back decades with this triumphant series of airstrikes last summer, and now suddenly it's so perilous and imminent that we have to launch a massive war right now?
Well, setting it back decades is not the same as destroying it. And the reality is that whatever President Trump may have said, until you actually remove the capability of creating a nuclear program, you can't end it. And what that means in reality, Iran, even if you do remove all Iran's enriched uranium, that doesn't end their program. The only thing that, in my view, will end an offensive nuclear program by Iran is the removal of this regime. And that, of course, is what most people desire. Most people who are fighting this war anyway desire. It's what Middle Eastern countries desire. It's what Israel desires.
Right, but that has ceased to be one of the aims of the war, because they all know it's not happening. And so they have very quickly moved away from talking about regime change. You don't hear any of them talking about regime change, certainly not on the American side, because President Trump knows from his own intelligence people there is no chance of this happening unless there's a massive commitment of troops on the ground, which is politically impossible for him. So I do think, and maybe bring Benjamin Rad in here. I mean,
Can I just say, I don't think the regime change was a specified objective of the war. It was a desired outcome.
But it was being talked about on day one again by President Trump.
And I don't think you can say there's no chance of a regime change happening. I don't believe it's going to happen as a direct result of military action. But I do believe that within the Iranian regime now, both within the political echelon and within the IRGC, there is severe fracturing. Now that in turn, and Naftali Bennett said, he can't predict how long it's going to take for the regime.
He said years.
Well, it could take years, but certainly I think this action will help facilitate potential regime change by weakening the regime and causing internal division in the regime.
The trouble is, okay, let me bring in Benjamin Rad. I mean, the problem is, I just don't see the hard evidence this regime has been weakened. I can see they've lost their supreme leader, a lot of their top people, but they seem to have been replaced very quickly. The new lot appear to be pretty intransigent, unwilling to do any kind of easy deal that Donald Trump would like them to do. And the Strait of Hormuz, which is the only really discernible thing we can look at as to whether they have control or not, they are controlling the Strait of Hormuz in a way that is causing enormous economic damage the longer it goes on. And that is unsustainable for the Gulf states, for the United States, for everybody, apart from probably Israel, who don't care that much about the Strait of Hormuz, but they can afford not to. But everybody else who does care is seeing just massive economic hardship.
Yeah, let me touch on several points that have come up. Number one, on the nuclear program. Iran was, through last summer, a nuclear threshold state, a breakout state. If we separate the nuclear program into the weapons side and the enrichment side, you want to prevent Iran from enriching uranium beyond the 19% threshold, which is basically beyond that, you're now passing civilian use, medical grade use, energy use, right? You're going into weapons grade territory, 90% being nuclear bomb level. Iran it's been proven, it's been shown, both by IAEA and intelligence sources, had exceeded that 20% threshold in violation of the JCPOA, or excuse me, in violation of the NPT, going back to the 1970s when it was first drafted. So then what the United States would target would be Iran's ability to construct a warhead, because it's not enough to actually enrich uranium to 90%. You need to then make it small enough and workable so that you can fit it onto a warhead. It's possible the United States set back its warhead production facility capabilities. That we don't know. We haven't received a lot of clarity on that. We need to separate that from its enrichment capability. It can still enrich if it has centrifuges buried under mountains. That is the concern. If your concern is that this is a country that should not go beyond that 20% threshold, no country under the NPT should, then that is a legitimate cause for concern. Is it enough to go to war? I'm not saying it is, but I want to separate the two elements here. Number two, the second part of this becomes, again, revolutions, which is what we're talking about here. When we say regime change, we're talking about a revolution. They happen slowly until they happen quickly. You cannot predict the timetable. Nobody can. There's a whole host of factors. Number one, there is an imbalance of arms. You have the Iranian people are not armed. It wasn't until the Shah's army started defecting, we started seeing weapons pouring into the hands of civilians. We started to see a hesitation on the part of the Shah's army and the police to shoot the protesters in 1979, that the tide began to turn. We haven't seen that yet. We might not see it. But to say sort of, okay, why hasn't this population risen up? Why haven't they done this? They are genuinely afraid of being mowed down like they were January 7th and 8th earlier of this year. So there's all of those concerns at play. Now, the Strait of Hormuz, that is a card that this regime gets to only play one time. By that, I mean, it will be a matter of time before the Gulf states, regional allies, the international community, trade, all of this figures out a way to circumnavigate or bypass the chokehold that Iran has on the strait. And it is a chokehold that goes both ways, by the way, because if there is a blockade, if there is a if there is a hesitation of maritime traffic and trade to come through, it impacts Iran as much as it impacts the international community. So if we're looking at a war of attrition based on who will capitulate first, I don't think anyone can confidently predict how that will turn out, except that I think the international community will develop the means, methods, and resources to eventually figure out a way out of the strait, whether it's bypassing through land routes, other routes, and then what does Iran have left? That's why I said it's a card it can play one time and one time only. Then what will it do going forward? So, and then your question about the status of the regime, again, there is a lot that we do not know.
Right.
We know that there's internal division. We know that the president, for example, has been bypassed in the power structure completely. We know that, Ghalibaf, who is a prominent figure, the Speaker of Parliament, has now been marginalized as well. Where is power currently residing? There is disarray